So, the EU purists like to often claim that George was involved with the EU and even will refer to his work on some projects as heavily involved. Using the word involved carries a certain connotation. How involved was he really? What was his involvement? Was he writing chapters of books, doing outlines for comics, designing gameplay elements on video games? After all, George was very heavily involved with the stories in TCW, but EU purists reject that. So, based off of that, how much greater was his involvement in the EU? Really, it must be something, right? Let's dive in. EU purists love to bring up quotes about George's involvement in the EU. Let's take a look at some quotes. According to Brian J. Jones, a biographer, in 1995, George convened a Star Wars summit wherein he gathered licensees and international agents to Skywalker Ranch to reinforce, quote unquote, the need for him to maintain quality control, especially in the areas of publishing, where some characters, such as Luke Skywalker, who had been given a love interest in a fiery smuggler named Mara Jade, were living lives far beyond the ones he had written for them in the original trilogy. Interesting. George had a desire to get involved for the sake of quality control. We'll come back to that. Timothy Zahn, when asked how much Lucas is involved in the novels, Tim said, "As far as I know, George Lucas himself is not involved. He has a liaison group that deals with the book people, the game people, etc. They do the day-to-day work. Occasionally, he will be asked a question and will give an answer." This is interesting. This is in 1997, several years after Heir to the Empire. Tim Zahn was the first EU author in the 90s and probably one of the chief contributors in the era. He also, as we'll see later, got to meet George Lucas briefly after his book sold really well, something the other authors didn't seem to get to do aside from the prequel novel writers. So his words certainly carry a weight. And as he just pointed out here, in 1997, 6 years after the first EU novel came out, Lucas is not involved, but has others manage it for him. According to Tom Veitch, or I hope I'm saying that right, it was decided that we should submit questionnaires to George Lucas. Basically, we would make a long list of ideas we wanted to use, and he would check okay or not okay to each idea. So Lucas's involvement seems to basically be checklists and vetoes. According to an interview with Tom Dupree in the New Yorker on December 30th, 1997, it is only the continuity editors that send checklists of acceptable events and story ideas, not actual authors, so there seems to be a barrier typically. He says new developments in even the remotest corners of the Star Wars universe are always approved by Lucas himself. The continuity editors send him checklist of potential events, and Lucas checks yes or no. When Bantam wanted to do the backstory on Yoda, Dupree said, George said that was off limits because he wanted him to remain a mysterious character. But George has made available some time between the start of Episode 4, when Han Solo was a young pilot on the planet Corellia, and the end of the prequels, so we're working with that now. Sue Rostoni, who you'll remember was a key figure in the EU, said, in general, George doesn't see the overall story ideas or concepts. If there is a sensitive area, or if we are developing backstory for a character he's created or mentioned in an interview, we can query him to get more information, his approval, or whatever. And yes, we always query him if we're doing something drastic to a film character. I believe he does read the concepts for the games, though. This was in 2004. This is a good little nugget here. This seems to imply most of the EU stuff simply ended up at her doorstep or the other EU officials, and that George rarely got involved, even on an outline basis. When asked if Lucas was invited to comment on major story developments like marriages or children, Sue said, "No, not necessarily. I believe we let him know that Luke was getting married, but I doubt we informed him of Ben." This is even more telling. Even major things didn't necessarily get brought to Lucas's attention. Yeah, they let him know about Luke marrying Mara, but he didn't even get told Luke was having a son. How about them apples? J.W. Rinsler, who interviewed George for several making of Star Wars books and worked alongside him briefly on TCW, said George had bigger fish to fry. He was trying to change filmmaking with the digital technology. He wasn't going to get involved in the minutiae of the expanded universe. He, quite literally, had better things to do. Again, J.W. Rinsler interviewed Lucas about the making of several Star Wars movies. This is telling, especially when it comes to the prequel era. Once that kicked off, Lucas simply didn't have the time. This really ties into the Clone Wars multimedia project and what we discussed about earlier. When asked if she was at the top of the food chain, Sue Rostoni said this, No, not really. Ideas pass through me, the director of publishing, the director of licensing, and the president of licensing before we try to sell them to Del Rey, in the case of adult fiction. We all have input into the publishing program as a whole. Once things get ironed out and progress to the actual creative process, then the author, Shelley at Del Rey, Leland, Tasty, and I work on manuscripts, with input when needed from the bosses and others like Pablo or folks at LucasArts, depending on the content and the questions. We all work as a team, hoping to produce the best possible books. That's the abridged version. What's interesting here is that she lays out the basic process for EU management. There's one key figure missing, George Lucas. Nowhere was his involvement alluded to here. And even if Bosses was supposed to be, because she says here that she's working on it with the author, Shelley, Leland, they're working on manuscripts with input when needed from the bosses. To me, based off the context of the whole quote, that seems to be referring to licensing director, president of licensing, etc. But while it's possible that's a reference to Lucas, again, he said when needed. So another one, there really isn't any story to tell there after Return of the Jedi. It's been covered in the books and video games and comic books, which are things I think are incredibly creative, but that I don't really have anything to do with other than being the person who built the sandbox they're playing with. This is George Lucas, and this is 2008. George himself admits he had nothing to do with the EU. Yes, I know he said the story after Return of the Jedi is covered in the EU, but as I've already shown, he's more than proven that he didn't count it as canon, and he also distanced himself here by emphasizing he has nothing to do with it. Gendy did most of the animation and most of the stories for the first experimental series. I'm pretty sure I brought this one up already, but here he gives Gendy the credit for the 03 Clone Wars. He doesn't take any credit for himself. Lucas approves every important addition to the canon. Leland said this regarding Force Unleashed and Vader having an apprentice. What's interesting is this basically confirms that there are less important things that Lucas never comments on or approves of. Dave, referring to Dave Filoni, can quickly reference things from other media like the Star Wars books, comics, and video games, which are based on what I created, but I don't actually get involved with too deeply. Dave loves them, and his knowledge gives us a better picture of this entire universe. George, again, not only compliments Filoni, but also says he's not really involved with the EU. Talking about the courtship of Princess Leia, the author said, "It was a painless process that was pretty much all of my creation, and I just felt lucky and grateful George Lucas signed off on it." Again, all that novel came from the author. George just merely approved it. That's some heavy involvement, huh? One I'd really like to point out is Dark Empire before we get any deeper. Lucas has been on record saying this. And now there have been novels about the events after episode 6, which isn't at all what I would have done with it. The Star Wars story is really the tragedy of Darth Vader. That is the story. Once Vader dies, he doesn't come back to life. The Emperor doesn't get cloned, and Luke doesn't get married. George also told Ian McDiarmid that Palpatine was absolutely dead after Return of the Jedi. I remember saying, "Is he dead, George?" at the time, and he said, "Yes, he is. Absolutely." When EU critics like to bring up this quote, EU purists like to bring up the quote from Tom Veitch, Dark Empire creator, who said this. Tim, referring to Timothy Zahn, hated the idea of the Emperor coming back and probably wasn't aware that George Lucas had proposed the idea to us. Our original proposal was to bring back Darth Vader's costume and mask with somebody else inside it. We think the Empire would want to maintain the fearsome image of Vader and wouldn't much care who was wearing the armor and breathing mask. George vetoed that idea, although he did allow us to have Vader appear in dreams and memories. He said, "No, you can't bring back the Vader costume. But if you can figure out how to bring back the Emperor, that's okay. The obvious way to bring back the Emperor was with cloning, which George immediately approved." However, is that true? Lucy Autry Wilson, a higher up in the EU, as we've already discussed, had this to say. And then for the novels, I mean, we just, in the beginning, just let the people write what they wanted. What Tom Veitch, the story he wrote, we were just kind of letting people do what they wanted then. He wrote his story. I didn't ask George anything. We published it. Later, George would run into me and he said, "Lucy, I would never clone the Emperor. He doesn't get cloned." And I'm like, "How am I supposed to know that if you don't want to be involved in what we're doing? And yet, if I do something you don't like," so I started then having to send them memos, this person wants to do this, this, and this. Is this okay? Is that okay? So initially, George wasn't involved in the first wave of EU stories, as we've already shown from Sue Rustoni and now from Lucy Autry Wilson, both higher-ups in the EU management. Also, keep in mind here that she says that George didn't want to be involved at first. So keep that in mind whenever you try to make it seem like George came up with Howard and the two together decided to move forward with EU and post Return of the Jedi stories. But based off of George's displeasure he's expressed about the Emperor returning, I think it's safe to say Lucas and Lucy Wilson are probably right, and the idea didn't actually come from George. But if that's the case, then why would Tom Veitch say that? It's possible he was lying. He was the creator and he did have a financial stake in this. But I don't think that's quite it. It's possible that the EU authors didn't necessarily all understand the inner workings of the licensing side of the company, the many chiefs involved and the cooks in the kitchen, and how that all related to George Lucas. He probably just assumed that because Lucasfilm higher ups allowed it, it came from George, when in reality, it came from someone else. Some might try and fight this and say, well, why is Lucy Wilson not saying anything beforehand? Why is she only saying something now? This is after the buyout. Isn't that suspicious? No, Lucy Autry Wilson departed Lucasfilm in 2010. Disney is irrelevant. As to why she wouldn't have corrected Tom Veitch on this beforehand, Tom Veitch said this in a Facebook post, and it wasn't even a straight up post on his account, it was a chat on Facebook or in the comment section of a post. It wasn't him saying it in an official manner in Lucasfilm capacity. Keep in mind, Tom Veitch hasn't done work for Lucasfilm since the 90s. So that is irrelevant. This is Lucy Autry Wilson just simply having an interview. This wasn't her coming out to just debunk Tom Veitch. This was a 2-hour interview where she was just talking about her role at Lucasfilm, etc., and this popped up. And if you look in the context of the comment, this isn't her saying, "No, Tom lied, he was wrong," etc. She got to this point as kind of the breaking point for George getting a little bit more involved in the EU and not just being super hands off. Tom Bites was the breaking point, so she brought that up. She wasn't saying he was wrong or that he previously lied or that he misunderstood. This was just an independent interview. And if I'm being honest, based off my reading of the situation, it seems like Lucy Autry Wilson didn't even know that Tom Veitch probably said that it came from George. Well, what about the infographics? Someone online, a Reddit user, the Jedi Praxium, made several infographics compiling quotes about Lucas's involvement with the EU for many major projects. So first off, thanks to him for compiling all that. But let's go through them to dissect how grand this involvement really was. Keep in mind what we've already established from Sue Rastoni and Lucy Wilson about George's involvement, and especially keep in mind the situation with Dark Empire and Tom Veitch and the apparent misunderstandings there. Let's dive in. Let's start with the Hand of Thrawn. So, Timothy Zahn said, when they came back at the end of 1993 and asked me to sort of bookend the Bantam series, I thought about it for a while. I came up with two things I needed to do if I was to do the book. One was to end the war between the New Republic and the Empire, and two, to get Luke and Mara together. If we're going to do some kind of closure to the Bantam series, those two events needed to be done. And they came back and they said, okay, the first one's fine, but we'd like you to leave Luke and Mara's relationship ambiguous. And I said, well, in that case, I'm not really interested in doing the book because I think that's something that needs to be done for closure. It took a little while longer, and finally they decided in early 1994 to do it. Michael Stackpole, another EU author, said, what I could say is that George did approve Mara and Luke marrying. This I have from Tim. In my experience, that if anything was going to happen with any of his characters, George signed off. As noted before, he may have changed his mind for any number of reasons, but when that first Bantam contract was in place, Luke and Mara were going to marry. That was set at the time. I know that, as with any of the novels, everything was cleared through Lucasfilm, and 100%. For anything as major as a love interest being developed for Luke, that's a decision that George would have given a yes or no on. Tim also said, all the other authors knew that Mara and Luke were going to be married in 1993 or 1994, and none of them leaked it. It's kind of amazing. It's amusing because we would read things on the internet, people who would say, I know this for a fact, Lucas will never let Luke get married. Don't ask me how I know, but I've got an inside track. We're standing there looking at each other. Sure you do, fella. But yeah, that was the idea. That was the story. It never leaked. And so when they brought Callista or someone else in, the writer would write her back out again. It was one of the best kept secrets in the whole Star Wars EU at the time. I don't think anyone leaked it. I always thought they would be a good couple. They needed time just to be friends. Mara had baggage, Luke had baggage, and then to work it out in the Hand of Thrawn duology, that was in the back of my mind all the way along. Drew Struzan, an artist, said, when asked how familiar he was with Mara Jade's character, All I knew about her and all I did were to paint a picture of the girl a couple of times. I found it a bit challenging as she was only a slimly developed idea in some creatives' mind at the time. It's quite a jump from the drawing board and imaginations of these artists. In reality, she had come to life in my style in order to match the real life forms of Luke and Han. So I found a model that seemed to me to be a good living example of what Mara would be, costumed her to match in spirit what the other artists had created, and submitted the sketch to George. Apparently the vision wasn't so far off that they turned it down, so my vision of Mara became another of the acceptable visions of who she might be. I think it is quite fun that she has a tendency to be a bit of a chameleon. I understand that she has developed into quite exciting and interesting ideas since then. I have learned that she and Luke have gotten married subsequently, but I haven't even seen Luke in a couple of years. I wasn't invited to the wedding and have never even met the girl. As recounted by author Barbara Hamley, it was decided at a higher level that another character, and not Callista, was to be the great love of Luke's life. So, this is telling. Mike Stackpole claims the marriage approval came from George, but he doesn't know that. He believes that because of what Tim said and his own preconceived notions of prior experience, which, as we've shown, just because a writer believes it came from George, especially in the beginning, that doesn't mean anything. Especially in regards to his film characters, since, according to Sue Stoney, George wasn't involved with giving Luke Skywalker a son. Normally, it just means the higher up at Lucasfilm Licensing, like Sue, Howard, Lucy, etc. As far as what Tim relayed to Mike, he never really got that from George. Lucasfilm execs simply said he could write the book, and Tim took that as approval from George. A full quote. When they came back at the end of 1993 and asked me to do one more book to sort of bookend the Bantam series, I thought about it for a while and came up with two things I needed to do if I was to do the book. One was to end the war between the New Republic and the Empire, and two, to get Luke and Mara together. If you're going to do some kind of closure to the Bantam series, those two events needed to be done. At first, they were unwilling to have Luke and Mara be married, engaged, whatever. They wanted it left ambiguous. I said those were the two things I feel are needed for closure. If it wasn't agreeable, someone else could do the book, that's fine, and it was one book originally. And then they came back and agreed to let me do that. So it was immensely fun during the next few years to watch all the rumors stating that Luke was cursed, that he could never get married because Lucasfilm had decided Luke would never be married. All the time knowing that, yes, he was set up, and all the authors knew he was set up, and so they were bringing it to that direction. So any woman they brought in would eventually be written out or put in a friendship mode or whatever. So it wasn't a matter of Lucasfilm saying no, it was a matter of that the other authors were aiming the same direction I was. So with the Hand of Thrawn, it appears Lucas's involvement was either non-existent or simply allowing Luke to marry Mara, something Lucas had knocked since and clearly left out of his own post-Return of the Jedi stories. Again, retconning the EU. So now let's look at the Thrawn Trilogy. So Timothy Zahn said, "Not my original instructions from Lucasfilm consisted of exactly two rules. I could start 3 to 5 years after Return of the Jedi and use any character who had not been killed off in the movies. Lucas did read the original outline. They looked at the outline and told me a couple of things I couldn't do. They didn't want me to refer in detail to the Clone Wars to make sure I didn't step on George's yet-to-be-written prequel toes. Originally, Jorah Sabayoth was going to be an insane clone of Obi-Wan Kenobi, but they said no. The Nagri were going to be the Sith. Vader is mentioned as Lord of the Sith in various places, and I wanted them to be the Sith that were referred to. That one was another one of the ideas that was canceled by Lucasfilm. Aside from those things, I had pretty much a free hand. I was very grateful. When Steve Sansweet was asked what is the origin of Coruscant and its name, the idea of a city-covered planet was in the early drafts of the original trilogy scripts, but George Lucas wasn't able to get it onto the big screen until the prequels. Many scenes in Return of the Jedi were originally going to take place on the city planet, but as the script evolved, they were later relocated to the second Death Star. In these early drafts, the planet was called Had Abaddon. The name Coruscant came from author Timothy Zahn for his 1991 novel, Heir to the Empire. It's actually a real word that means glittering or giving forth flashes of light. When it came time to name the city planet for the Phantom Menace, after considering several other names, Lucas decided to go with the already established Coruscant. According to Sahim Zahn, I don't think George ever read my novels, but my trilogy was adapted into comics, and I heard he does read comics. It's a visual medium, he's a visual medium guy, movies and such. I can only assume that's where he picked up the catching the Force lightning on a lightsaber blade, because I've written that into Dark Force Rising, and I'm sure he pulled it from that, probably from the Dark Horse adaptation. Apparently, George thought that would make a cool visual and put it in Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith, and by golly, it does. So he has been keeping a close eye on what has been done. Betsy Mitchell said, Heir to the Empire hit #1 on the New York Times hardcover bestseller list, almost unheard of for a science fiction novel at that time. It went on to sell millions of copies. Tim and I were invited to Skywalker Ranch in San Rafael, California. We had the pleasure of meeting George Lucas, who thanked Tim for his contribution to the Star Wars universe. And then regarding 1995 Short Tale, I don't know who wrote this one, but it has to do with Mara Jade. Pablo Hidalgo said, Mara exhibits very articulate telepathic communication with the Emperor, a use of force telepathy far more precise than shown elsewhere in the canon. And that discussion actually surfaced, and this is the research I found. It did end up being in a memo that went to George Lucas as a July 19th, 1994 memo indicates. Such a display of force power needed to be vetted by George. Lucas specified that this telepathy is due to an innate difference in Mara Jade herself and should be limited to her alone. So it goes to show that at the time, that was the level of communication and stuff that had to be vetted in that process. So according to this one, the only involvement from Lucas in the Thrawn Trilogy was he read the outline and he said Mara's force power should be something specific to her and not a generic one. So that's it. Let's dissect. Based off of Tim's words, his mandate came from Lucasfilm, not specifically George, and a lot of the vetoed ideas were vetoed by Lucasfilm. George reading the outline could simply be an assumption on Tim's part based off of what we already established, especially Tim's own words. But if we're giving him the benefit of the doubt, reading an outline is not contributing. This was essentially the return of Star Wars stories for the first time to the public eye in 6 years. I'm sure George might want to have an idea of what's going on. That doesn't mean he kept up with all the outlines. The Force ability had to be vetted by George because it was quote-unquote such a display of Force power that it needed to be vetted by George. This implies a lot of other stuff wasn't vetted by George. Either way, so George's contribution was one note on a Force power? That's it? And even then, that's from a different story 4 years later? It's not even tied to the Thrawn Trilogy? So as far as we know, the grand return to Star Wars and key pillar of the EU storytelling had no contribution from George Lucas. Let's take a look at Tales of the Jedi, the 1993 comic series, not the 2022 animated miniseries. Kevin J. Anderson, when asked where did the Sith come from creatively, he said George Lucas. When I sent in the proposal for Exar Kun in my Jedi Academy trilogy, I proposed that he'd either be the spirit of the Dark Jedi or a Dark Lord of the Sith. Whichever was preferable, Darth Vader is referred to as a Dark Lord of the Sith. Lucas said to make him a Dark Lord of the Sith, so then I had to ask what a Dark Lord of the Sith is. Tom Veitch and I gave him a 2-page questionnaire about what Dark Lords of the Sith can or can't do, and Lucas defined all the parameters for us. Tom Veitch said, adding Exar Kun definitely altered the storyline. It gave us a chance to dig in the ancient history of the Sith. Together, Kevin and I suggested to Lucasfilm that we explore the history of the Sith. They said George will never go for this. He loved the idea, of course. His only rule was that I had to submit my ideas to him for final okay. We made it all up, and Mr. Lucas gave his approval. I can't remember that he rejected anything. In fact, I came up with the idea of a 2-bladed lightsaber. I also conceived the idea of a Jedi fighting with a lightsaber in each hand. Chris Gossett, my first collaborator, drew a wonderful realization of that. When asked what was the creative process like, Dario Carracasco Jr. said, I would sketch each ship, character, or scene and then send them to Dark Horse Editor, who would then submit it to George Lucas for approval. I was aware that Lucas added all these characters, ships, and creatures to the Star Wars universe, hence why it had to go through the approval process first. Through the whole process, there was only one that came back from Lucas with regards to the designs I had initially sketched, and it was the sarcophagus of Marka Ragnos in the FOTSE. I don't know what that title is. Forgive me. I was asked to revise it as it resembled too closely to an Egyptian sarcophagus. I modified it and sent it back, and it was approved. Christian Gossett said, a belief on my part was that the lightsabers of the Old Republic should have an elegant handcrafted look to them. They should be objects of lethal beauty. Why not a lightsaber blade at the end of a polearm? Why not a curved handle? Why not a lightsaber with 2 blades? These all seem like fine ideas to me. I did sketches specifically for George, the first he would see of these new variants of Jedi weaponry. If he rejected them, fine. Happily for us, he accepted them. I still have the Lucasfilm internal memo with his signature on my studio wall. Tom Veitch also said, we had prepared questionnaires to explain what we wanted to do. Those were reviewed by George because he wanted to make sure if we're going to tell about the ancient Jedi, he wants to have input on it. We have to write very carefully detailed questionnaires and list the ideas we want to use. He reads them and gives approval or disapproval. He had to see lists of our ideas and plans and give approval for each thing. So he was definitely involved in the genesis of the ancient Jedi Order. As recalled by Kevin J. Anderson, a collection of the Tales of the Jedi series was distributed 1 year by George Lucas as the annual Christmas gift to all Lucasfilm employees. So, first off, we've already shown Tom Veitch has had misconceptions about what really comes from George Lucas and what comes from Lucasfilm. So it's very possible that none of this actually came from George and it was other Lucasfilm officials. Or that it was mixed. Some of it came from George, but some of it came from officials. But you know what? Let's give them the benefit of the doubt for argument's sake. I won't slander them as constant duplicitous liars to fit my narrative like EU purists do to Filoni on TCW to fit their narrative. So, running with these statements as facts, it would appear George's involvement was basically to sign off on everything. As far as the questionnaire, based on the accounts described here, that wasn't George saying do this or do that. It was them making a list of traits and concepts about the Sith, and George just simply said yes or no based off of what fit his personal vision of the Sith. And even then, keep in mind the novelization of The Phantom Menace, as well as George's own personal words, both of which we already discussed, contradict the established history of the Sith from Tales of the Jedi. Tales of the Jedi ran from 1993 to 1998, so either George did approve these and changed his mind within the next 5 years for Phantom Menace, something he maintained 20 years later, or he approved it but changed it because he didn't see the EU as canon, or in reality none of this actually came from George and Tom and crew just again misunderstood where concept approvals actually came from. You're welcome to read this however you want, but I'm going with the second one. I've also seen some people suggest originally Tom Veitch wanted to do Darth Vader hunting all the Jedi down, and Lucas rejected that. But in reality, according to Star Wars Insider 158, it was Lucy Autry Wilson who turned that down because of her concerns that might cause issues with the upcoming prequels. Also, keep in mind here that they said that they basically just took the questionnaires and formed a lot of the history and story off of that. So it wasn't George Lucas pitching a story with them. It was George said, yeah, here's my ideas of the Sith, and they formed a story with that. Also, some people might bring up the whole thing about the lightsaber handles and how George took that from the EU and used that in the prequels, like the curved handle for Dooku or a double-bladed lightsaber for Darth Maul. That doesn't mean he saw these as canon. It just means he saw a concept, he liked it, and took it. As Tom Veitch himself had said, and we discussed way earlier in the video when talking about the prequel EU references. So now, let's talk about the Jedi Academy trilogy. So, author Kevin J. Anderson said, in my original proposal for the Jedi Academy trilogy, I had suggested that Exar Kun could be the spirit of a long dead Dark Jedi or a Dark Lord of the Sith that had fallen centuries ago. George Lucas said he wanted me to use a Dark Lord of the Sith. I found that very exciting for about 10 seconds, until I realized I didn't know anything about the Dark Lords of the Sith. In order to learn more, Tom Veitch, who was interested in the same information for his comics, and I put together a questionnaire where George could give us some insights into how he should develop the background. Based on George's answers, we put together the history. Tom Veitch said basically we would make up long list of ideas we wanted to use, and George would check okay or not okay next to each idea. For example, I made a long list of possible powers that the ancient Jedi possessed. He vetoed most of them, but okayed some rather interesting ones, such as the ability to study the qualities of animals and acquire those qualities. He also okayed the use of Jedi battle meditation, the ability to influence events by interior visualization. I also wanted to explore the spiritual aspect of the Jedi as much as I could, so I asked for guidance in that area. George replied with the cryptic note, look to Buddha. Kevin J. Anderson also said, I spent a lot of time developing Jedi training and learning the Force for all the books, much of which was based on input and memos from George. The Durney-style mind probe and the Force sensing battles, those were additions I was specifically asked to make at the last minute, and not my original plan for the trilogy. The idea of a new Jedi Academy was my own conception, but it seemed a very natural extension of the material. Something had to be done to bring back the Jedi. I thought Luke was the most interesting person with the most to lose and the most to gain. I took his character away from the I am Superman and I could do anything with the Force, and developed him in the spirit of a true Jedi the way Lucas had intended and drawn him. Kevin also said, on the subject of smuggling spice and what it is, was Han as much the scoundrel as he appeared to be. That was actually from some discussions with Lucasfilm people. I was writing Han going into the spice mines of Kessler where he used to smuggle the spice out. I was told by some politically correct people at Lucasfilm, spice can't be a drug because Han was smuggling it. That makes Han a drug dealer. You can't have one of our main characters be a drug dealer. I said, it's spice, and he's running Imperial blockades. What did you think it was? They said, well, it's like a food flavoring. He's not going to be flying through Imperial blockades with a shit full of oregano. It was actually a discussion. I went, he was a scoundrel, and he redeemed himself and joined the Rebel Alliance. It got to the point that we were butting heads enough that we sent a letter to George Lucas to settle our conflict. Was spice a drug, a food additive, something else? George wrote back, I love this. He wrote back, of course it's a drug. My compromise was not to make it something like crystal meth that people were dying from. We had to make some decent aspects of it. So, some of this is repackaged from the Tales of the Jedi infographic, but interesting to note that based off of Kevin's first answer, something I've already kind of mentioned, it would appear George didn't explicitly give them all the history of the Sith for them to include. They simply got some yes-no answers and made up the history themselves based off of that. The last Kevin Anderson quote shows how little George was involved. Kevin was debating with Lucasfilm about the material, and George only got involved because the group of them couldn't settle the matter. But even then, it wasn't too big. It was just yeah, he was smuggling drugs in the original film. It was an interpretation of Lucas and his original film, not Lucas saying what to do with the EU. The second Kevin quote talks about the making Jedi training and learning the Force for all the books, and they were based off of George. This wasn't specific for his book, but for the EU in general, so it's very likely these memos and input he mentions were either notes on the Force the writers had access to, or they were questionnaire-style things from George. Either way, it's not him giving story input, but simply answering questions the author asked him about how the Force works. That's the thing with these, more than often than not, it's the EU guys asking George questions, not him getting involved in what they're doing. Kevin even said the whole Jedi Academy idea was his own conception, and everything he did with Luke came from him, not George. As for Tom, so George's only thing to him was a redirection on where to get answers to his questions? Going to Buddha? So for the Jedi Academy trilogy, George's involvement can be summed up with he provided information on how the Force works, redirected an author on where to get answers to a question, and telling Lucasfilm employees that yes, George made Han a drug smuggler in the original film. Everything else came from the EU guys and Lucasfilm employees. So now let's talk about the illustrated Star Wars universe. Kevin Anderson said, it's a project with this big, beautiful book, like a National Geographic coffee table book of the planets in the Star Wars universe. I got to work with Ralph McQuarrie month after month for like a year and a half. Working with Ralph was an awesome experience. He has such a cool, nonstop imagination that I would have a great time just brainstorming with him. I met George, I think, twice, and he wanted to meet me because this project meant a lot to him, because he was so close with Ralph. He had approved the Jedi Academy books, and he thought I would be a good pick for the illustrated Star Wars universe. Ralph McQuarrie said, generally, I did series of thumbnailed sketches. Every concept, every character design had to be looked at by George. As a matter of fact, I have a notebook filled with roughs with George's okay written on them. It was the same way we were doing in the movies. Kevin researched everything he could, and I pinpointed the things I wanted to illustrate. Then Kevin made outlines based on our talks. We were going to do Hoth, and according to George, there was nothing on the planet except ice and snow. There were no ancient civilizations. There was no nothing. I asked, what are we going to do for Hoth? And he said, maybe you can come up with some ice formations. I came up with what I could. Kevin said, with the chapter on Dagobah, George told me that Yoda wasn't from Dagobah, so we couldn't have art and text about a race of Yodas running around in the swamps. He didn't say it like a big secret or awesome news, just as a passing comment as we discussed the various chapters. After George told us we could do a chapter in Alderaan, I showed him one of the archival paintings we had found and asked him directly, did we use this as the basis for Alderaan? And he said, yeah, that looks like Alderaan. Also, we learned that Coruscant is pronounced Coruscant, not Coruscant. George himself said it during some brainstorming sessions, so that's the pronunciation that counts. He was so happy with the book when it came out that George bought a copy of it for every employee of Lucasfilm for Christmas. Ralph also said, I loved working on that project. I was able to do what I wanted to do, fool around and have a good time. We tried to make it seamless to extend George Lucas's original vision for the films into this book. The style I had established for Star Wars was ideal. I'm so used to working in the Panavision format, figured we could just continue that for the most part. I have a good feeling for scale, contrasting tiny figures against huge backgrounds. My sense of perspective is also very dramatic, which is perfect for a concept like Star Wars. I guess that's why George keeps using me. Our final quote is from Kevin as well. A lot of the work I did with Ralph ended up being digitized into the special editions, like the Coruscant stuff and the Cloud City backgrounds. I get a thrill when I see it. We made up on Bespin the Tabana gas mines, so we came up with all these gas refineries floating in the clouds. And all the stuff that was on Coruscant and Attack of the Clones. Those were from these paintings that we developed in this book, and a bunch of the nightlife descriptions and things. I think it's cool that that's just a big pat on the back that George liked the stuff that we created enough that he wanted to make use of it. So, this one seems unique. George seemed pretty involved in this one. But this isn't a standard EU novel. It was almost written like an in-universe travel guide. The planets featured aren't EU planets, they're planets from the films, with maybe the exception of Coruscant, but even then that was going to be a big focus in the prequels that were being developed around the same time. So George was commenting on basically background information from his films. On top of that, George didn't get so involved with this one because it was an EU book. He got involved because, as Kevin says, it was a project that meant so much to him because he was very close with Ralph McQuarrie and Ralph designed every image in the book. They bring up some of the Coruscant stuff being an inspiration for Attack of the Clones, but that wasn't because George kept the films consistent with the EU. It was because this was taking inspiration from Ralph's artwork, just like the classic films. And a lot of this was background from George anyway that he worked on with Kevin regarding background for the films. Like the Tabana gas mines, for example, though. Kevin's trying to take credit for that, but in one shot of the original version of Empire Strikes Back, there is a weird looking Tabana gas mine in the distance, and then those are obviously changed and modified for special edition scenes. So this says a lot about George's involvement, but this was this particular project. This was something George seems to be pretty involved in, but it was the exception, not the rule. And then again, it was something that tied directly to the films and not the EU. So let's talk about the Bantam Era of books. There's a series of books here, so I'll just kind of read off the quotes. The titles that they're associated with are obviously listed on here. Tom Dupree. From the beginning, we'd give the Lucasfilm people our ideas, then they'd prepare a 1 or 2 page checklist of the most important story affecting points, allowing George to answer yes or no. Can Han and Leia get married? Yes. Can they have kids? Yes. When Bantam wanted to do the backstory on Yoda, George said that was off limits because he wanted him to remain a mysterious character. But George has made available some time between the start of episodes 4, when Han Solo is a young pilot on the planet Corellia, and the end of the prequels, so we're working with that. Drew Struzan. Bantam had a series of books they were doing and they needed an artist to paint them. What's special about this situation is that it was George Lucas who recommended that I do them. So it came from George's mouth and George's opinion that I do the books. Bantam called me and said, "Would you like to do them? You were recommended by George." So I said, "Of course I would like to do them. Who wouldn't? It's become a very steady job. George is particularly fun for me as he wanted to be an illustrator when young, so he appreciates and values illustrators." Michael A. Stackpole. At the time, the way it was explained to those of us authors, when we sent material in, we were allowed to ask up to 5 yes or no questions that they would take to George to be answered. Very early on in the planning stages, because I was filling out the entire squadron, I asked whether or not it would be possible to have a Mandalorian in the squadron, just because I liked that look. And at that time, Mandalorians were not at all defined. When I asked, Lucasfilm said that George had said no, that George apparently had something in mind for them at that point. Kevin J. Anderson with Darksaber. I had always thought General Crix Medine was a fascinating character from his brief background, as I described in West End Games material. I proposed using him as an important character in Darksaber, and that I wanted to kill him off as a dramatic high point at the climax. At first, the Lucasfilm people squawked, but I explained to them what I wanted to do, and why I then had to explain the scene directly to George, showing how I intended to use Medine as a Nathan Hale sort of martyr hero. George liked what I suggested and gave me explicit permission to do so. The Courtship of Princess Leia, Dave Wolverton. At that time, George was actually going through and he read the outline. He made a couple of notes that basically said, "This sounds really cool." George provided a list of Jedi powers of Luke Skywalker. By making him able to talk to animals, I was able to make him more of a priest of nature to tie in with my love of nature. He ended up being very nice about the whole thing. It was very much all my creation, and I just felt lucky and grateful George signed off on it. You can't judge fan reaction to a certain degree. I did get a fan letter from George Lucas. As recounted by Pablo Hidalgo, George Lucas would eventually feature Dathomir and the Night Sisters, first introduced in the Courtship of Princess Leia in the Clone Wars TV show. So, bringing in Drew to do art was George's suggestion. Okay, that's not necessarily involvement. If anything, that's marketing. That's, hey, I know a guy if you want. Steven Spielberg suggested both Frank Oz and John Williams to George. So was Steven heavily involved in Star Wars? I don't see people saying that one. As for Tom, Mike, and Kevin, they basically show Lucas's involvement was basically answering yes or no to 5 of their questions. That's it. An entire book, and they only get 5 questions to take straight to George. Wow. As for Dave, George read the outline, made a couple small suggestions, and then told him, "Hey, by the way, this is what Luke Skywalker can do, just an FYI. So when I show my script to a friend and he reads it and gives me ideas, does that count as, heavy involvement? Does that mean that the story's his?" Aside from Dave's book, the involvement is still basically just saying yay, nay to a few things. And even in Dave's case, it's more than 0% involved, but I wouldn't say it's more than 1 or 2. Aside from a couple notes or whatever new force abilities Luke had, nothing else came from George. The next infographic for Bantam books, Black Fleet Crisis, Michael Q. McDowell. I needed to get outline approval from Bantam, from Lucasfilm, and from George. George Lucas personally read and approved the outline for the first Black Fleet Crisis trilogy. It's my understanding that that's been the procedure for the other Bantam novels as well. The final step in the development process for a Bantam novel outline is when it's submitted to Lucas personally for his approval/comments. My understanding is that if Lucas frowns on an outline, it doesn't get the green light. No novel is added without his blessing, but that blessing comes at the outline stage. I needed to be conscious of where the ground had been tread before, the scope of the post-Return of the Jedi storylines contained in other novels, and to some degree, the other licensed materials. In my original proposal for the trilogy, I intended to give Chewie multiple wives and make them the kick-ass volunteers who fill out the Falcon's crew. I was advised that Chewie already had a family, and I was sent a copy of a kid's picture book based on the holiday special, which says to me that, however hated, it's viewed as canon by Lucasfilm. A.C. Crispin in the Han Solo trilogy. I proposed the plot to Lucasfilm. They okayed some of it, turned thumbs down on other parts. I kept proposing stuff, they kept approving things, and eventually I had a complete plot. It took quite a while to get the whole plot line for the trilogy approved. George Lucas does read and sign off on a short synopsis of each project, 1 to 2 pages per book. When I first accepted the assignment to write the Han Solo trilogy, I was told that I could set Han Solo's story against the backdrop of the Emperor rising to power. But then Mr. Lucas changed his mind about that. I do not know why George Lucas ordered that I not cover Han and Chewbacca's meeting in my story. Mr. Lucas doesn't have to explain himself, as you can imagine. When I asked the Lucasfilm rep, the answer was we don't know either. I also wasn't allowed to write about Han's time in the Academy or the Imperial Navy. I had really wanted to get Han mixed up with Palpatine and Vader early on, but that was a big no-no, which was odd because apparently early on Mr. Lucas had said that would be okay, but he changed his mind and he's the boss. So I had to look for other antagonists for Han to interact with and be in conflict with. I needed someone powerful with lots of money, and we already know Han was working for Jabba at some point. So I decided to make the Hutts the antagonist because they fit the requirements. Roger McBride Allen on the Corellian trilogy. The outlines were critiqued, modified, rewritten, and with luck approved. Part of the approval process in such cases concerned itself with whether the story was good. Part of it is concerned itself with making sure the story idea matched the rest of the imaginary universe and didn't cause continuity trouble now or later. In the case of my 3 Star Wars books, one key plot line was thrown out by Lucasfilm because what I wanted to do might interfere with future plot lines. All of the writers hired to do the Star Wars books had written and published books of their own because they had track records. Only after contracts were signed and the outlines were approved did the writers actually write the books, and of course the final book was likewise subject to approval. So this one seems to be similar. Michael and A.C. Crispin both reiterate that Lucas's only involvement was reading a brief 1 to 2 page outline, which kind of seems to contradict what Stackpole said about a brief few questionnaire, and then approving it. Roger's inclusion here is weird though because he doesn't mention George Lucas at all. So now let's get to Shadows of the Empire. So Howard Rothman, we're all familiar with him by this point. We'd never before shown organized crime in the Star Wars universe from the top down. The basic storyline in Shadows of the Empire was to look at the crime syndicate and reveal an organization structure that mirrored the perceptions of our own earthbound existence. The sense is that this powerful crime syndicate has many branches and that the government and organized crime serve each other's interests. That was the only direction that George Lucas gave to this project. He wanted the underworld to be believable and have an antecedent in the real world. He liked it a lot. He always looks to parallels in the real world, and he liked the idea of going off in this direction. He didn't add story input in the sense of changing the contours of the story. The biggest advice or guidance he gave was to have as grounded in reality as possible. And this kind of things that happen in the story have to make sense whether they would work in the real world. He's very conscious of creating things that exist in a fantastic environment, but not in an illogical environment. Joel McNeely said, I think it was a very cool project, a very interesting idea, which was promoted by Bob Townsend and the people at LucasArts, and which furthermore George felt to be very thrilling. And so they called me and told me what it was all about and asked me whether I might like to join in and write an hour of music with no picture for a huge orchestra and choir. I thought, yeah, that sounds like fun. I think if you think about the movies, you think of George Lucas and John Williams. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm saying this because I'm a composer, but he is such an integral part of those movies that it was presumptuous of me to even do Shadows of the Empire, and I always felt very strange about that. Indeed, I only went ahead with it because this whole thing was with George Lucas's full endorsement and approval. Steve Perry said, we had a big meeting at Skywalker Ranch, which was a great experience, by the way, where basically everyone who was going to be involved in the project was there. The story conference, we basically just sat down at a big table and started throwing stuff out, and I'm taking notes. I came home and I wrote an outline, probably the most extensive outline for anything I've ever done. I think it was probably like 50 double-spaced pages, and they sent that in. And once they started approving and disapproving, then we just were going from there. Later, what happened was I have a friend who's a writer who went to a big writing conference someplace at which George Lucas was featured. He had a copy of Shadows of the Empire, so she took it over to him and said, "My friend Steve wrote this book. Would you autograph it?" So he autographed my book. And so I have a note from George Lucas on the inside of the thing saying, "Great job, love the work, George." Well, I don't know if he read it or not, but he said so I was happy. Greg Hildebrandt said, when asked what was it like working on art, for instance, the card of 3PO and R2 flying the Falcon, that was a fun picture to do. In fact, if I remember right, that was one of George Lucas's favorite pictures. I think he kept that one. That's the one he had to have. Those trading cards were quickly done too. We had a pretty fast deadline on that, 4 months to do 100 paintings. All of our sketches had to be approved by Tops and Lucasfilm. It's wild to be involved with a project like this one. You're waiting for the movie, but there's never going to be a movie. We really enjoyed working with Ira and everyone at Tops and Lucasfilm. When it was ready to launch, we were invited to Skywalker Ranch for a day. Now that was a treat. It says here on the bottom, as recounted by John Knowles, George Lucas would eventually include the Outrider spacecraft in the special edition of A New Hope, ship initially designed by Doug Chiang for Shadows. So the basic idea of having a story about organized crime that was grounded in reality is all that came from George. That's it. Howard Rothman mentions George giving no story input, and his only input was about the basic idea of the crime organizations and grounding in reality. And Steve makes it clear that George was not present at their big meeting. Joel just seems to be talking about the project in general, having George's approval. And as far as Greg's comments, all that means is George simply likes some of the artwork. Below, it mentions John Knowles. He's a computer programmer for the video games. Based off of that role, it's doubtful he would have any insider knowledge into the inner workings of putting together the special edition. There's no quote here or context. He's most likely saw the Outrider in the special edition and assumed it was George. We already addressed this point. So, one of the biggest non-film television projects at Lucasfilm, in fact, at the time, probably the biggest project, and today has only probably been rivaled by the Clone Wars multimedia project, is something that, at best, the only real involvement for George was the very basic idea to do a story about organized crime similar to the real world, and he didn't even show up for the big meeting about it. Cool. And the story and all that was hashed out by other people. It's also been circulated on the internet that George Lucas said he loved Shadows so much that he would make a movie of it if he could. Matt Wilkins even called that a direct quote in his EU video he uploaded about 10 years ago. But after further researching, it would appear this is nothing more than hearsay and there is no source to back this up. So let's talk about LucasArts. This is Darren Stinnett, when George started LucasArts, he gave the mandate that LucasArts was not here to simply commercially exploit his Star Wars stories, that LucasArts existed to create new IP, new characters, new stories to entertain in its own right in this new medium. From that developed a strong culture within LucasArts that story and character mattered. People wanted to work there because they admired George, and that very quickly could have turned into being stifled by George. But he let us do our own thing. He wanted us to go out and create our own stories and adventures. It was an amazing place to work, a very creative, carefree environment. It was a heck of a lot of fun. David Fox had this to say. Rescue on Fractalus. It was supposed to be a Star Wars game when I first conceived of it. I kind of wanted to capture the feeling of being in an X-Wing. I wanted it to be a Star Wars. When I realized we couldn't do that, it was okay since we kept the game design the same, just not in the same universe anymore. The original game design was purely a rescue mission. When we first showed the game to George Lucas in the summer of 1983, he liked the idea of flying around a lot. The first thing Lucas tried was pushing the red joystick button, and he said, "Where's the fire button? Why doesn't this do anything?" I told him there wasn't one, that we were trying to make a game that was nonviolent, and he said, "Well, was it because it served the gameplay or because it served your personal values?" And I said, "Well, it's really a personal values thing," and he said, "Add a fire button." So I added a fire button, and he was right. Rebel Assault, Bill Tiller. What was interesting about Rebel Assault was that I got to film Star Wars footage. Nobody had thought to do it before. When I did it and I showed it to him, George was like, "Yeah, it's fine. It's kind of a wide shot. I would do a closer up shot." And I was like, "Well, I can't do a closer up shot for technical reasons." He was like, "Yeah, no, it's fine. It looks good. Keep doing more of it. This is the future. I'm all for it." But George was like, "You're kind of luckier than I am because you guys have got 320 by 200 graphics, and I'm doing film which is 300 DPI, super high res. Since you are so low res, you could do all these effects that look just fine. You don't have to do a big production. You can just film in a conference room or something." And I was like, "Yeah, that's what I said." Vince Lee. This is the first time George Lucas has let anyone else film a live action Star Wars fantasy, so it's really an honor to be making this game. This was a very ambitious project. There are some 175 video shots, about 45 minutes worth of it, and every shot had to be composited with the animation. Rebel Assault 2 will really be like playing a Star Wars movie. George Lucas was especially concerned that this be a quality show. If you're going to do a video with his name on it, you had better do it well. The video is meant to advance the story. It's not trivial branching. It involves your progress as a pilot in this saga. We were dealing with props that were 12 years old. It felt like being part of history. According to developer Noah Falstein, at the start of LucasArts, George Lucas gave 3 specific directions: stay small, be the best, and don't lose any money. So, according to Darren Stinnett, George basically let them do their own thing. He just gave them the mandate of striving to be quality gaming and entertainment, not just commercially exploiting customers. Sounds like a lot of involvement to me. According to David, George's involvement was basically playing a little bit of it and then telling him to add one gameplay function. So, heavily involved. According to Bill, George only gave one suggestion, but once Bill explained the impracticality of that, George backed off. Funny, because on the films and TCW, when George was told it wasn't possible, he didn't take that for an answer. Interesting. According to Vince, George just basically said, make it good. Doesn't sound too terribly involved here. Darren Stinnett on Dark Forces. There was this unwritten rule at LucasArts that we couldn't make Star Wars games. Everything had to be original stories and characters, and before Dark Forces, there had never been an internally developed Star Wars game. George Lucas helped us out by giving us feedback on important aspects of the game, such as the design of the new Dark Troopers. Later, George had a party at Disneyland to celebrate the opening of the Indiana Jones ride. I piggybacked on that, got some press for the game, and was showing George. I was pretty proud of what we'd made, and I was kind of waiting for him to be blown away. He was not happy that we were shooting the Imperial officers. He said, "You shouldn't have those guys in there because they're too human looking. There's a reason I made stormtroopers, because I didn't want to feel like you're shooting other humans." I was like, "Really?" I was so destroyed. But then I showed him how to play it and he got into it. And by the time cameras got rolling, he was running around and jumping over bits and shooting things and having good fun. At least for the cameras, I'll say. He was a Dark Forces natural. Kevin Schmidt. We were a licensee just like anybody else, even though we were still owned by George, so we had to get everything approved. Back then, the choice for Mara was extremely controversial, but we fought for her all the way to the top, and I'm glad she was approved. I pushed to include her action figure with the game, lost that fight. When we started making Mysteries of the Sith, it was at the same time George was starting to formulate what the prequels would be, and that meant he was coming up with what the Sith would become. That there can only be two, and all of those rules that he put in the prequels, so a lot of our stuff got shot down. We would submit this packet of info. We had all these Jedi enemies that we had planned, and they were like, no. And it made sense later now because George had this rule of only Jedi can have lightsabers, and there could be only two Sith, so all of our ideas got scrapped. That's where the Sith undead came from. We actually threw them in as a joke. They were like, cut the lightsabers, cut the Sith undead, sure, yeah, you can have those guys. And we were like, what? Okay, well, I guess that's our only enemy. We have Sith undead who shoot force lightning at you. John Knowles said for Bounty Hunter, the team at Lucasfilm, I suggested I come up with a list of 10 yes or no questions to send George Lucas, like, can I explain how Dooku chose Jango to be the clone template? Can I explain how he came to own the Slave One? Can we kill off Gardula the Hutt? The answers to nearly all the questions I gave George Lucas were yes, and the trademark red ballpoint pen. He went further, even writing in the margins of the page, offering insight into how he thought of Jango. When I asked if I could give Jango a revenge motive, he wrote, keep it about the money. He wrote the simple reason Jango wanted a son was, in a word, legacy. As a fan of Boba Fett lore, I wanted to remap a lot of that mythology to Jango, but I would need to get George's blessing. I asked him, can I apply some of the now defunct Boba and Mandalorian lore and all that stuff on the Jango Fett, and he said, absolutely. In the Tales of the Bounty Hunters anthology, Jaster Muriel was Boba's actual name. We gave that name to Jango's mentor. I was grateful that George allowed me to do that. So, according to Darren, George just gave some minor feedback, and the rest of the game was, per his own words, something he and his team made. Even though George had fun with the gameplay, he still expressed how Dark Forces wasn't fitting his vision with the Stormtroopers. If he was involved, he should have caught that. Regarding Kevin, it sounds like a lot of this came from Lucasfilm, and they were trying to line it up with what George had in the films. For John, George basically just did a yes-no and gave him thoughts on the inner workings of a film character. Also interesting to note that John says he asked Lucas about including now defunct Boba and Mandalorian lore, which demonstrates to any EU purist still hanging on to this idea that the Boba problem with the prequel trilogy got fixed and is no longer retcon. It absolutely was, at the time, a retcon on behalf of Lucas. So let's talk about Star Wars Galaxies. George Lucas said, I think the sense of an online community will play a large role in the future of interactive gaming. For instance, the LucasArts is developing a game that will allow thousands of people from around the world to explore Tatooine and other Star Wars planets together. I think that's just amazing. One thing about Star Wars that I'm really proud of is that it expands the imagination. I think that's a very healthy thing for children to be able to create their own little worlds, to have their imagination sparked by something like Star Wars and then be able to recreate that and play with it and make new stories. Well, that kind of play has progressed and now it exists on the internet. It's happening at light speed, and now you've got these games where they'll be able to create that same kind of thing in real time. Aiden Blackman. George knows about Galaxies and he's excited about it. He's been consulted on anything that might tread into episode 2 or episode 3 material. So when we decided that we wanted to include Naboo as one of our planets, a decision that was made well before the release of episode 2, he had to weigh in on this and give us a real seal of approval. So he's been involved in some discussions about Naboo in some other areas. When there's an issue, then it kind of goes again or goes all the way up to the flagpole, and George approves that. But as with all our games, he lets us develop our own ideas and take the license in new directions. Grant McDaniel. With our expansion Trials of Obi-Wan, we really wanted to make sure the players had an opportunity to interact with Obi-Wan Kenobi. The challenge that we had with this is during the time period our game is set in, Obi-Wan has actually been killed and is only shown at this point as a blue glowy Jedi. Traditionally, we've never actually seen a glowy Jedi interact and somebody who is not a Jedi, but we wanted all players of all professions to be able to interact with Obi-Wan. So we put in a request to Lucasfilm, and that went actually all the way to the top of Lucasfilm from what I understand, and they actually gave us permission to allow people, regardless of if they are Jedi or not, to be able to interact with Obi-Wan, which offered a really unique opportunity in our game. Rich Vogel said some things had to go all the way up to George himself to approve. When Galaxy showed the player places that they'd never seen in Star Wars before, George would review them to make sure that we didn't conflict with the films. At that time, no one knew Stormtroopers were clones. No one. We were told not to talk about it at all, and that was a really, really important secret that George Lucas wanted to make sure that was kept within his group. So that was the reason you could not play as a Stormtrooper in the game. George Lucas's son would come and play the game and give us feedback. He was just a teenager, but we listened to all of his feedback. He's a really good gamer. Actually, we got to know each other really well. Jet Lucas, George's son, said, Galaxies for me took all the magic of watching these movies and catapulted me into the universe. Facing down massive crate dragons, kneeling before the Force Ghost of Ben Kenobi himself, flying my very own Jedi Starfighter through the stars, space will forever be my favorite part. I grew up with this game as much as any one of the movies, playing till 4 or 5 a.m., knowing damn well any minute Pops would be rounding the corner for his morning workout. Despite those late hours, I'd still daydream of the tone ship paint job I hadn't tried yet. Or, oh yeah, a planet in the carrier of that hull is just what I need, only to have all new goals by 4 a.m. the next morning. Lucas in 1994. I think view on demand games will take off. Interactive games will be popular, playing with 2 or 3 other people at the same time at various places, just like being next to them. So George's words seem more about pushing forward technology and admiring that as opposed to being involved in the story and game development. Notice how the words at the bottom are also almost 10 years earlier and aren't necessarily connected to this game. Hayden and Rich's words make it pretty clear a lot of stuff came from them. Lucas was just consulted on stuff connected to the films or brand new stuff to make sure there was no film contradictions. As remember, the rule of the EU was it was bound to George. Considering they were all in development at the same time, it makes sense to try to correlate a little bit. Grant's words make it pretty clear that it was Lucasfilm this went through, not George specifically. Jet Lucas liked the game? Cool. He never mentions his dad involvement, though. Also, not sure why they're bringing up Jet, especially since he works on visual effects for the Mandoverse shows. Are they going to use that involvement to say the Mandoverse is George's canon? Especially since that's some actual involvement, and this is basically just him playing the game. So now, let's talk about Republic, the ongoing Star Wars comic series from 1998 to 2005, initially dubbed Star Wars, later redubbed Star Wars Republic. John Ostrander said, "We know, having been told by George Lucas that the next war took 2 to 3 years. He said the next movie will start with the end of the Clone Wars. When Dark Horse learned that George would not be covering the Clone Wars in any detail, we felt that we had a real opportunity here. For Republic, I submit an overview of the story that's first a few pages long. This gives Dark Horse and Lucasfilm the general outline of the story. For Quinlan Voss, I actually scripted it both ways, one where he died and one where he lived. Everyone was expecting Quinn to die, and I don't always like to do what's expected. We ran the ending you saw past Lucasfilm, and they didn't mind, so we went with it. Where all has been doom and gloom, a touch of hope seemed nice. I was prepared to kill off Quinn if that made a better story. In my opinion, we went with a better ending." Jan Durisma said, "When John and I were working on presenting Twilight to George Lucas, we asked if we could develop a new Jedi from a character who appeared in The Phantom Menace. I spotted this interesting looking guy wearing what I thought resembled Jedi robes. John let me have my way, and Quinlan Voss was created. I thought Obi-Wan mentioning Quinlan Voss and Boz Pitty in Revenge of the Sith was very cool, a nice real nod to the EU. I understand George first saw Ayla Secura on a cover from the Darkness arc that was painted by John Foster. It was incredibly cool to see Ayla come to life on the big screen. I was not asked to make changes to how Ayla was portrayed in the comic, but once I get the reference of Amy Allen as Ayla, it just seemed right to make the comic book Ayla look more like her. It was cool to see Ayla made real." Pablo Hidalgo said George liked Ayla Secura, Quinlan Voss, Vilmar Grog, and wanted to use them in places. Found the memo where they asked George if Ki-Adi-Mundi could be a knight on the council, and if he could have multiple wives, and he checked off yes to both. George was particularly enamored with Quinlan Voss. He read the comics. He liked this character in Revenge of the Sith. Master Voss almost made it into the movie in Order 66 montage, but only got as far as an animatic. Gillian Libert said, "Getting the character of Ayla Secura to look like what George wanted was our primary goal. He answered a few questions we had related to the character's body image, but ended up that he wanted the costume to look like the comic book character and the body to be human-like. George liked the overall look. We had to change the headdress a couple of times because he wanted a different style. He was very specific in what he wanted, down to the detailing on leather pieces and the way the leather trim was wrapped around the tentacles or Leku. When we started building Jedi, oh, this is George Lucas, by the way. When we started building Jedi, we had a lot of Jedi and we needed more, and I had realized that we had a comic book that has a Twi'lek in it that is a Jedi. There's a whole series actually of her, and I said, well, why don't we put her in this? I mean, she's a comic character, but we'll just fit her in and have her be a background character because that's exotic. And that's how the Twilight Jedi ended up in the backgrounds of these shots. It was to try to use some of the work and effort that the guys in the comic book world had put into things and characters they had created. Both Quinlan Voss and Ayla Secura would also go on to appear in the Clone Wars television show, with George Lucas helping to outline their stories. So, John's words show Lucas had nothing to do with it other than giving them the timeline between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. Interesting how Jan says there was no concern to make the comic version of Ayla match the now casted actress, and it was only her own intuition that led to that. Surely Lucas would have been more concerned about that had he counted it all as the same thing. As for Pablo, so George liked the character and he wanted to play with him. Doesn't mean he's canon or the other stories are canon. It just means George wanted to take something that he liked and put it in the films and work with it in that world. As for the Ki-Adi-Mundi thing, we've already addressed that. Gillian's words don't bother me. He liked the design, so he wanted to implement what he liked. I've addressed George's words earlier regarding Ayla. Nothing more to say. Interesting, though, how it notes below that both Quinlan and Ayla would go on to appear in TCW and that George helped outline those stories, even though EU purists cry foul at Quinlan's depiction. So that looks like George had such high regard for the EU, that he, apparently, according to EU purists, messed up Quinlan's character. Overall, though, keep in mind Republic lasted 73 issues. Sorry, actually, it was 83 issues. And not all of them were about Quinlan. This doesn't really speak to George's involvement. And at last, let's finally talk about the new Jedi Order series. This is the one I see EU purists like to claim a lot that George was heavily involved in, even though his sequel trilogy would have been different. But let's take a look. So, Lucy Wilson We had several creative sessions over the course of the new Jedi Order series development. The first one took place in 1998 and lasted 2 days. In this initial meeting, the major points of the entire story were plotted out. The initial 5-year plot outline and early thoughts on who might die were sent to George Lucas in the form of a Q&A memo and subsequently discussed by phone. We knew that for anyone to really take a new intergalactic war seriously and to realize it was not fiction as usual, someone who mattered would have to die. This was a unanimous agreement. Who would die was the subject of much debate. However, our first thought was that the death of Luke Skywalker would have the biggest impact on the readers. However, this was not okay with George Lucas. Shelley Shapiro said, interestingly, when we were deciding to kill off somebody and then who to kill off in Vector Prime, George told us we could kill Han. That has changed since, but at the time, the only ones we couldn't kill were Luke and Leia. But I refused to kill Han. Chewie was the character we all agreed on. I think we made the best choice because his death would strongly affect every other major character in the series, so it would serve as a unique emotional catalyst, and it did. The death of a character close to all the other major players was a perfect way to give those other characters a natural and believable reason to reevaluate their lives and a change. And it also gave us the chance to grow the characters of the Solo children. Pablo Hidalgo stated, the arc's earliest descriptions had Luke Skywalker sending the 3 Solo children on an epic quest during which they encounter a female character from an invading species sent to infiltrate the galaxy. This unnamed female corrupts Anakin, nearly turning him to the dark side, but instead she falls in love with him and Anakin redeems her. In a fit of intense sibling rivalry, Jason and Jaina turn on Anakin, and the resulting conflict tragically ends with Jason's death. As readers of the series know, very little of this outline survived subsequent reworking. George Lucas commented on the story overview, making a number of specific changes. One note says, change person who is responsible for ultimately saving the day to Jason, not Anakin, and that was listed under the header, too redundant to movie storylines. Books should be more original, cited or dated 5/6/1998. Circled specifically in that outline is a mention that Anakin Solo, that he is the prophesied one. Sue Rostoni said, we discussed the hero's journey at length in the first creative meetings. After feedback from George, we decided on Jason as our hero and the character who would undergo the most dramatic changes. In many ways, the new Jedi Order is really his series. At those meetings, we charted the character threads for each of the main characters. We discussed how Anakin was the stronger of the siblings, and how his death would affect things. Since he was the obvious choice as Luke's successor, George did not tell us to kill Anakin. He didn't tell us to kill anybody. He approved the deaths of characters in theory, then told us who we couldn't kill. The creative group decided the main story plot points and deaths. The authors created the situations. James Lucino. I was hired to write an outline which we could submit to George Lucas, which we did, and he objected to some things and approved most of it. He played a major role in giving shape to the new Jedi Order by commenting extensively on the early version of the 5-year story arc. I distinctly recall George's taking particular exception to our careless description of Amini as dwarfish. Anakin was our first choice as the saga's hero, not Jason. When George nixed that idea, we were forced to rethink everything very quickly, as the first book was already being outlined. For the same reasons we wanted to have a personal tragedy accompany the fall of Coruscant, we wanted to convey the sense that the war has terrible consequences and that no one is immune to those. So, according to Lucy and Shelley, George's main contribution was simply reading the outline and letting them know who they could and couldn't kill off. Not a large pool of characters, just in regards to the OT characters. James mentions George had a major role in giving shape to the new Jedi Order. But as Pablo and Sue point out, George basically just said change the plot because it was too similar to the films, leading to them basically reworking the main character and entire story. While it had massive ramifications for George, there wasn't that much to do on his end. Sue even says the story and plot were created by their creative group, and then authors created the smaller story beats. None of that came from George. George had way more involvement in TCW than in this project. Shelley elaborated in 2000 on George's involvement, and it wasn't much. When asked about the development of New Jedi Order, a Del Rey editing director had this to say. Once we'd come up with a sketchy outline of where we wanted to go, start to finish, we had to get it approved from on high. For example, as I mentioned earlier, we were told we could not kill off certain characters. We originally intended the enemy to be Dark Force users. We were told they had to be non-Force users. We had a certain plan in mind for one of the characters. We were told to use a different character for this particular plan. That was about the extent of George's involvement, unless there was more going on behind the scenes than I was aware of. The writers have all been chosen by mutual consent. Some of them were suggested by me and approved by the folks at Lucas Licensing. Others were suggested by Lucas Licensing and subsequently approved by me. We really work as a team. That said, the final say always lies with Lucas Licensing. The writers have a lot of independence in coming up with a story, provided they work in the plot points necessary to keep the overall story arc moving along. I have a lot of independence as editor. Lucas Licensing doesn't even see an outline or a manuscript until the author, and I feel pretty confident that it's ready to be looked at for approval. If we disagree, we discuss the issue, even argue it occasionally, until we come to some resolution, but in the end, we make whatever changes Lucas Licensing requires. It's their intellectual property. Well, it's George's, but it's their job to protect that for him, and they have every right to control its destiny. So again, a lot of this came from Lucas Licensing. Very little came from George. So much for heavy involvement. Let's talk about Darth Plagueis. I see this one get thrown around a lot. It's been suggested and claimed that George Lucas was heavily involved in the novel Darth Plagueis. James Luceno, the author, had this to say in 2012. When asked about George's involvement in Darth Plagueis, the author said, George was involved in the early stages. When the book was first proposed, I wrote to him and asked whether there was any reason why Plagueis couldn't be a non-human, and he wrote back that Plagueis could be immune, and he sent me some artist renderings of the character. From that point on, everything was approved, as they're saying, quote-unquote, at the highest level. I worked most closely with George's right-hand man at Lucas Licensing, Howard Rothman. I had to make the assumption that Howard was speaking directly with George about a lot of this stuff. I didn't have any meetings directly with George, but it seemed like a lot of the approval was coming through him to Howard. I was not privy to all of the things that happened behind the scenes. So he basically assumed that George was involved, but had no confirmation on that, mainly working with Howard Rothman. And as we know, Howard Rothman had a lot of oversight over a lot of the EU projects. And Howard Rothman is a president of licensing. He was certainly a higher up. He was at a high level. The only thing James knew for sure that came from George was the species of Plagueis. Also in 2016, one of the writers on the canceled live-action TV show Star Wars Underworld, a show only canceled because of the extreme budget according to Rick McCallum, gave an interview with VentureBeat, and he revealed the show dived into the backstory of Palpatine, and what made him evil was basically a love story that ended badly from a really ruthless woman. That completely overrides the backstory provided in Darth Plagueis. I read the book. I know what the backstory is. From the sounds of it, the backstory of Han and how he met Chewie would also have been different in Underworld. Let's also dive into the Revenge of the Sith novelization, as I see Matt Stover get brought up a lot, and since the novel has a lot of EU references, it's been suggested that George being okay with this meant he saw the EU as part of his story. Is that really the case, though? Let's take a deeper look and see if that's true, or if EU purists are just reading too deep into this. First off, I'll concede that Lucas was involved in the film novelizations, at least of the prequels, based off of the evidence we have here. Way more than other EU contributions. I don't see any issue with this, though, as this has to do with his film as opposed to being another EU story. That being said, the impression of Lucas as having involvement with the EU and the story comes down to several quotes from Matt Stover. Not only has Mr. Lucas succeeded in tying together the entire 6-film cycle, and elegantly too, but I've managed to weave in a significant amount of the expanded universe material in as well. Having started in the Star Wars realm as an EU author, after all, I was really trying to bring the whole Star Wars universe together in this story, and while Mr. Lucas in his line edit decided to excise a fair amount of the EU material, he also left a fair amount of it in, so I guess that makes whatever's left just a hair short of G-canon for all the purists out there. As I said above, part of my aim here was to create a novel that would work as part of the EU as well as a companion piece to the film. He also said on a forum board, though I did not personally watch him do it, I received from Lucasfilm a Word document of Revenge of the Sith with Mr. Lucas's edits, which was distinct from the edits I already gotten from Sue Rustoni and Howard Rothman and the rest of the Lucasfilm crew. What's in that book is there because Mr. Lucas wanted it to be there. What's not in that book is not there because Mr. Lucas wanted it gone. But Stover also said basically Lucas let him do whatever he wanted as long as he stayed true to the story. His explicit instructions to me were to not do anything that violated the story as presented in the film. Beyond that, he said, just do whatever you want, make it good. While we know Matt Stover had a conversation with Lucas in person, their conversation was about the film, and this was the last in-person interaction regarding the book that they had. In 2019, an anonymous Del Rey editor on TheForce.net claimed that while they had no beef with Stover and they wanted him to come back and do more books with them, he was incorrect about Lucas doing a line edit of the book. Stover admitted he didn't watch Lucas do it. He was just making an educated guess that it was him because the line edits were distinct from Ristoni's and Rothman's. It's possible that it's yet again an EU author misunderstanding the behind-the-scenes process, as we've shown has happened time and time again. Or maybe it was Lucas. Take this information and make of it what you will, but even if it was Lucas, that doesn't mean Lucas approved of the EU references as canon per Stover. George just said stay true to the story and do what you want. And the EU references, at least the ones that are still in there, didn't necessarily detract from the film, so Stover was within his mandate. Maybe Lucas didn't care about some, and some he was like, nah, I don't know. Again, maybe it was Lucas, but we don't know for sure. And either way, it doesn't automatically mean he approved of it. Some have brought up the attempt of making a Young Jedi Knight show based off of the EU books. Per Rebecca Moesta, an EU author, a Fox TV executive brought up the possibility of doing Young Jedi Knights as a cartoon, but when Kevin and I approached Lucasfilm on the topic, we were told that no TV shows or movies in the Star Wars universe could be approved until after the new movies come out. Some ask why would Lucas do that if it wasn't canon? Why postpone until post-movies if the movies were separate and wouldn't trample on them? Well, doing a TV show simultaneously would strain resources. Also, Lucasfilm rejected this. Lucas had nothing to do with it and might not even know about it. Some might also bring up that he wrote the foreword in Shatterpoint. Okay? He wrote an opening prologue, and the prologue wasn't even about the book itself, just the war in general. It wasn't in the initial release of the book, and it was included here specifically as George setting up the war since this was the first novel and first story in the Clone Wars multimedia project. That doesn't really mean anything for the canonicity in George's mind of the Clone Wars multimedia project, and as for any other specific reason he might have done it, we'll get to that in a bit. Let's take a look at Force Unleashed. Here are several quotes from those involved. The ambitious story beats contained in the new game, Force Unleashed, were permitted only after he signed off and spent hours talking to the developers about the relationship between Darth Vader and the Emperor. That was from Leland Chi. We wanted to get input from George. He laid out there were things you had to have in a Star Wars story. You had to have adventure, you had to have humor, and then we show him the next presentation is this Wookiee game, and he looks at it and says, so I just spent the last 45 minutes talking to you about drama, and you present me a game concept where the main character doesn't talk? That was Jim Ward and Peter Hirschman. George is all about fundamental gameplay, and immediately when he saw that, that was what we were going to do. That was Jim Ward, and he's the president of LucasArts. He allowed us to give Darth Vader a secret apprentice. It is such a rich character opportunity. There are elements that George always made sure we were hitting, and if we came up short on one of them, he didn't hesitate in pointing them out. He would tell us, nah, I wouldn't go there, but did you ever think about this? Or, hey, why don't you create this new character? That's Jim Ward. We were able to show it to George, and he was like, yep, that's it. Go make that. That's Peter. Because of George's schedule, we had to actually put the story in the outline in a memo form to George. There was a day when we heard that fax, or that the fax was coming. You could immediately see that he had checked off basically yes, 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 all the way through. Added a couple of great comments. Bail Organa did this, and Leia was doing this. Jim Ward, an unknown Force Unleashed creator, just because I didn't catch his name. It was awesome to be able to take that fax in hand and go back to the team who had worked so hard on this for over a year and be able to say, this is it, guys. Peter said, the time between episodes 3 and 4 is an incredibly fertile time, and George encouraged us to develop new characters and to tell new stories. To unknown Force Unleashed creators, George was very big on make sure you have a love interest, make sure you have a comic sidekick. Hayden worked really hard on coming up with new and unique characters that also fit the very familiar archetypes within the Star Wars universe. And then Sam Witwer had this to say, George had influence on Force Unleashed. He guided Hayden Blackman and the team towards how they were supposed to make it. So I bring up Force Unleashed because it's an interesting case. First off, the story did not come from George. Again, it was other creators that came up with it. George approved it and then offered some extra minor notes regarding the current whereabouts of a couple film characters that they were wanting to use. The writers mentioned George also telling them core tenets of Star Wars stories. That's not him creating a story, that's him giving writing advice for them to make a story. George going in depth about the relationship between Darth Vader and the Emperor is similar to Tales of the Jedi. It's creators asking him questions, getting the notes on his views of Star Wars, and they included that in their game. I think it's also good to note this interesting quote about the development of The Force Unleashed. The team threw a Hail Mary to George saying the game would have more credibility if the apprentice had a Darth title, a Force Unleashed team member says. Lucas agreed that this situation made sense for Sith royalty and offered up 2 Darth titles for the team to choose from. He threw out Darth Icky and Darth Insanius. There was a pregnant pause in the room after that. People were waiting for George to say, just kidding. But it never comes, and he just moved on to another point. So, yeah, that's interesting for George's mentality on the game. I don't think he would call a film character Darth Icky or Darth Insanius. All that being said, it would appear George was more involved in this one, much more involved than almost all the other EU projects, perhaps even more involved in this than the 2003 Clone Wars series, but nowhere near as involved as he was in TCW in the films. If someone wanted to make a case that true George Lucas Star Wars was 1 through 6, TCW, and The Force Unleashed, I would absolutely be willing to hear them out and consider. But for someone to disregard TCW, which has documented way more evidence of his involvement than Force Unleashed, they'll include Force Unleashed genuinely doesn't make sense to me. An EU purist, Star Wars Scran, made a video about Force Unleashed and used Sam Witwer's words to support his argument. But Sam has also talked about George's involvement in TCW. That seems to not matter, apparently. It's also interesting that EU purists would accept this and not TCW for two other reasons. Ahsoka not ever being mentioned in prior materials like Revenge of the Sith, etc., is cause for some to say she retcons the canon, but Vader having a secret apprentice that has never been mentioned before is okay? Weird. Also, TCW is claimed to retcon the film, so it has to be disregarded, but Bail Organa makes his way on the Emperor's radar in the game's events. Yet the Emperor takes no action with the Organas for 2 years until the events of A New Hope. Interesting. Also, a crucial point to make is even if George considers this game canon in his head, and it's good to note, he's never talked about this since, unlike TCW, which is interesting, and he was way more involved in this than other EU material, that does not mean the entirety of the EU is canon to George. That just makes this specific game canon to him. Another fun thing to point out too, Jim Ward mentioned George didn't even attend the story meeting and they had to fax him the outline because of his busy schedule. This would have been in like either 2006 or 2007. Gee, busy schedule, huh? I wonder what he was busy working on then that must have been much more important than Force Unleashed. So as we've established, Lucas had minimal involvement in the EU. There are several other authors like Tim Truman and Jude Watson who have gone on at length about the lore created for their respective projects, not once mentioning it coming from George, but rather themselves. EU purists will still point out George often had to approve things. We've already brought up the quotes showing George did not approve everything, just the major things, and even then, he wasn't always consulted on major stuff. Just a reminder, though, in case. In general, George doesn't see the overall story ideas or concepts. If there is a sensitive area, or if we're developing backstory for a character he's created or mentioned in an interview, we can query him to get more information, his approval, or whatever. And yes, we always query him if we're doing something drastic to a film character. I believe he does read the concepts for the games, though. When asked if Lucas was invited to comment on major story developments like marriages or children, Sue said no, not necessarily. I believe we let him know that Luke was getting married, but I doubt we informed him of Ben. Keep in mind, I should have brought this up earlier, but it's interesting and telling. Sue said she let him know that Luke was getting married. They didn't necessarily ask if he could get married. They let him know that they were marrying Luke to someone. Another one from Leland Chi, Lucas approves every important addition to the canon. So some may ask, if Lucas really saw the EU as separate and didn't care, why did he approve certain things or tell them what they could or could not do? Well, there's one point that heavily connects to this, and I'll bring that up towards the end of the video. But to bring up some other points now that connect to this, there's plenty of reasons why he'd care. To go back to LucasArts infographic, Darren Stinnett said when George started LucasArts, he gave the mandate that LucasArts was not there simply to commercially exploit his Star Wars stories, and that LucasArts existed to create new IP. So while finances and profit were important, they weren't the only goal. Lucas has long ranted about Hollywood and the methodology of corporate suits impacting art. He wasn't about to be a hypocrite and let things in his company be made solely for cash. To do so would be contrary to what Star Wars and George and Lucasfilm represented. So a certain amount of quality control had to be maintained, or it wouldn't feel like Star Wars, but just generic cash cow science fiction. Just a reminder, as Brian J. Jones pointed out in 1995, George convened a Star Wars summit wherein he gathered licensees and international agents to Skywalker Ranch to reinforce the need for him to maintain quality control, especially in the areas of publishing. Vince Lee also said in the same infographic that George Lucas was especially concerned that this be a quality show. If you're going to do a video with his name on it, you had better do it well. Even though George wasn't a part of the EU, he still understood that it was a Lucasfilm product and would be associated with his name and his company and brand. Another point to make regarding things like approving character deaths, was most likely because of wider implications on the IP. Lucas has said these stories are supposed to inspire hope when they're meant for kids. So if they see their childhood character killed in some novel, that might have an effect on young audience members even if he didn't personally count it as canon. Kids aren't necessarily going to understand that. Regarding keeping things consistent, keep in mind a lot of the EU author questionnaires were not George coming to them telling them what to do, but the authors going to them asking questions about Star Wars. He was more than willing to work with them and tell them his views on Star Wars for them to try and incorporate in their stories. But obviously, this didn't always happen, just like with the stormtroopers and Imperial officers and Dark Forces. And just because he weighed in on it, it doesn't mean he considered it canon. George weighed in on parodies like Robot Chicken. Does that mean that's canon? Star Wars was an IP and a brand. He was in charge of a company. He had a duty to keep tabs on things and make sure things lived up to the name of Star Wars, regardless of whether he counted it as canon or not. And if you try to refute my whole thing about Robot Chicken was obviously a parody, well, Star Wars is EU was from the get-go supposed to be a separate thing, just like the Star Trek books were supposed to be a separate thing from the movies and the films. So George had that get-go from the beginning as well. I think this YouTube user's comment I saw on an EU-related video makes a very valid point, and I thought I'd share it just for additional insight. The comment is, when Lucas gave the EU writers a green light for an idea, or gave them ideas, that does not mean Lucas was adding all the EU to G tier. He knew it was a big playground. They were very separate in his mind. Lucas was helping EU writers stay closer to his vision, but not exact. Lucas saw the EU as a big playground for ideas, not the final story. The fact that Lucas cared to keep the EU semi-close to his vision does not mean that it is what he would have done, nor does it mean he accepts it as part of the same story as his film saga. His primary concern was the integrity of certain concepts and details that were important to him, but not at the expense of allowing these stories to be anything other than what-if type material. Lucas gave permission and input for these stories to be told, but he did not consider them to be a part of his story.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them in the light.